Life as a prostitute in the Middle Ages did not begin with choice. It began with circumstance. For most women, entry into prostitution was not driven by desire or moral failure, but by poverty, displacement, and survival. Medieval society offered few paths for women without family protection, dowry, or land. Marriage required resources. Service required connections. Religious life demanded acceptance and obedience. When those paths closed, the body became the last remaining asset. Cities grew rapidly in the medieval period, drawing migrants from collapsing villages, failed harvests, and war-torn regions. Young women arrived alone or were left alone by death, abandonment, or famine. In cities, food cost money every day. Rent did not wait. Hunger did not negotiate. Prostitution filled that gap with brutal efficiency. Unlike modern assumptions, prostitution was not hidden. It was regulated, tolerated, and often organized by authorities. Medieval governments did not seek to eliminate prostitution. They sought to control it. The reasoning was practical, not compassionate. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil, an outlet meant to protect respectable women and maintain social order. As a result, brothels existed openly in many cities. Some were municipally owned. Others were licensed and taxed. Certain streets were designated for the trade. Prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing, specific colors, ribbons, or markings so they could be recognized instantly. Visibility was enforced. Anonymity was denied. But tolerance did not mean safety. Prostitutes occupied the lowest rung of urban life. They had limited legal protection. Assault against them was often ignored or lightly punished. Rape was difficult to prove when society assumed perpetual consent. Clients could beat, rob, or abandon them with little consequence. Disease spread unchecked. Pregnancy brought danger rather than security. Medical knowledge was minimal. Sexually transmitted infections were common and poorly understood. Treatments ranged from ineffective to lethal. Women who fell ill lost clients quickly. Without income, illness became a death sentence. There were no safety nets. No recovery period. Only replacement. Age arrived early. Many prostitutes were teenagers by modern standards. Youth was demanded. Once it faded, options narrowed. Older prostitutes earned less, worked more dangerously, or were pushed into street solicitation, where violence was constant. Few escaped poverty intact. Religion shadowed every aspect of their lives. The church officially condemned prostitution, yet accepted its existence. Prostitutes were labeled sinners, but also described as unavoidable. They were excluded from certain sacraments, burial grounds, and communities. Repentance was encouraged but rarely made possible. Leaving prostitution required resources few had. Charity was inconsistent. Judgment was constant. Some women attempted reform through marriage or religious houses. Success was rare. Their past followed them. Reputation mattered more than intention. Society allowed prostitutes to exist, but not to return. Daily life was unstable and exhausting. Work occurred at night, in taverns, brothels, alleyways. Alcohol was common not as leisure, but as necessity. It dulled fear. It dulled pain. Violence was routine. Clients ranged from laborers to soldiers to merchants, each bringing risk. Pregnancy was both common and dangerous. Children born to prostitutes faced stigma and poverty from birth. Many were abandoned. Some were sold into service. Infant mortality was high. Motherhood offered no protection, only added burden. And yet, despite everything, prostitutes were woven deeply into medieval urban life. They were recorded in city accounts, mentioned in laws, referenced in sermons. They existed everywhere and belonged nowhere. This contradiction defined their existence. They were necessary yet despised, visible yet ignored, controlled yet unprotected. The medieval prostitute did not live on the margins by accident. She was placed there deliberately, absorbing social pressure so others could pretend order existed. And this was only the surface, because behind regulation, morality, and survival lay something darker. A life measured not in years, but in endurance. And endurance had limits. The reality of medieval prostitution grew harsher with time, not easier. Survival demanded constant negotiation with clients, authorities, and the body itself. A woman's safety depended on where she worked. Brothels offered structure but little protection. Street work offered freedom but near certain violence. Neither guaranteed survival beyond the short term. Municipal brothels were often presented as orderly spaces, but control flowed one way. Rules governed when women could work, what they wore, how much they charged, and where they lived. Leaving without permission could result in punishment. Earnings were shared with owners or city officials. Debt was common and deliberately maintained. A woman who owed money could not leave. Her labor became obligation. Violence was normalized. Clients arrived drunk, aggressive, unpredictable. Refusal invited retaliation. Compliance invited harm. Bruises were expected. Broken bones were endured. Reporting abuse was pointless. Courts rarely sided with prostitutes. Their testimony carried little weight. Their bodies were considered already damaged, already compromised. Soldiers were among the most dangerous clients. During campaigns, armies flooded cities with men carrying trauma, weapons, and impunity. Assault increased. Disease spread rapidly. When soldiers left, women were abandoned with infections, pregnancies, and no compensation. War consumed them without acknowledgement. Disease defined their lifespan. Syphilis emerged late in the medieval period, spreading rapidly and violently. Earlier infections existed as well, misunderstood and untreated. Symptoms disfigured. Pain intensified. Clients vanished. A woman sick enough to be visible was finished. Many died slowly, isolated, blamed for their condition rather than treated. Medical intervention was rare and often deadly. Bloodletting, mercury, cauterization cures harmed more than helped. Rest was impossible. Hunger forced women back to work long after their bodies should have stopped. Aging was unforgiving. A prostitute's value declined quickly. Youth was currency. Once lost, survival required more clients for less pay. This increased exposure to danger and disease. Older women often became brothel keepers, recruiters, or enforcers, but only a few reached that position. Most simply disappeared from records, likely dead or destitute. Attempts to leave prostitution rarely succeeded. Marriage demanded a dowry and reputation, both usually gone. Religious institutions accepted repentant women in theory, but spaces were limited and conditions harsh. Many were turned away. Others entered and died shortly after from illness and exhaustion. Redemption was preached, not practiced. Children complicated everything. Some women kept them, working while pregnant, returning days after birth. Others abandoned them anonymously at churches or hospitals. Infant mortality was high. Surviving children inherited stigma. Daughters often followed the same path. Sons entered labor early or crime. Poverty reproduced itself efficiently. Despite this, medieval cities depended on prostitutes. They were taxed, counted, regulated, used as tools to channel male violence away from respectable households. Their suffering was considered functional, necessary, ordered. Moral condemnation coexisted with economic reliance. Sermons warned against sin while cities profited from it. This hypocrisy was not accidental, it was structural. The prostitute existed to absorb contradiction. She was visible enough to be controlled, invisible enough to be discarded. Her body became a boundary marker between acceptable and unacceptable desire. Society blamed her for corruption while relying on her existence to maintain order. This psychological burden mattered. Prostitutes lived knowing they were despised by the same system that required them. They internalized guilt taught by religion and law. Shame became constant. Alcohol dulled it. Faith complicated it. Hope rarely survived it. What history often misses is that these women were not passive victims. They formed networks, shared information, warned each other about violent clients, negotiated prices, manipulated rules where possible. Survival demanded intelligence and resilience. But resilience had limits. In the end, medieval prostitution was not a profession, it was a slow erosion of health, of safety, of identity. Women entered young and exited early, often through death rather than choice. Their lives were short, visible, and quickly forgotten. And yet, medieval society could not function without them. That contradiction was never resolved. It was simply endured. By the late Middle Ages, the life of a prostitute was shaped as much by exhaustion as by danger. Years of irregular sleep, alcohol, poor food, and constant stress wore bodies down quickly. Women in their 20s were often described as old, not because of age alone, but because survival had accelerated decay. Teeth rotted, skin scarred, posture changed, the body carried its history openly, and clients noticed. When a woman could no longer work regularly, the city did not intervene. Regulation existed only while profit existed. Once income dropped, tolerance evaporated. Brothels expelled unprofitable women. Landlords refused rooms. Authorities enforced appearance laws selectively, often using them as justification for fines or expulsion. A woman who could not earn still owed obedience. Homelessness followed easily. Former prostitutes drifted between taverns, alleyways, and shelters attached to churches. Charity existed, but it was conditional and humiliating. Assistance required confession, repentance, and submission. Even then, it was temporary. Hunger returned quickly. Violence increased as protection disappeared. Street prostitution exposed women to gangs, thieves, and men who knew no one would intervene. Murders were rarely investigated. Disappearances went unrecorded. A woman could vanish from a city without trace, absorbed by the margins where history did not look. Public punishment reinforced this vulnerability. Prostitutes accused of disorder, disease, or moral disruption were paraded, shaved, beaten, or expelled. These acts were framed as moral correction, but they functioned as warnings. Visibility had always been forced. Now it became weaponized. Religion offered no escape, only contradiction. Churches preached mercy while reinforcing exclusion. Prostitutes were used as moral examples, symbols of sin, cautionary figures in sermons. Yet the same institutions accepted donations from brothels, blessed soldiers who frequented them, and relied on the order prostitution created. The burden of sin was individualized, never systemic. Some women clung to faith as the only remaining structure in their lives. Others rejected it entirely. Both paths were lonely. Forgiveness was promised, but rarely delivered in material form. What is most striking is how normal this arrangement felt to medieval society. Prostitution was discussed openly, legislated carefully, and morally condemned without urgency to resolve the contradiction. The system did not fail these women accidentally. It functioned precisely because of their expendability. Their suffering stabilized social hierarchies. Their labor absorbed risk. Their presence redirected violence. They were not outsiders. They were infrastructure. This is why records mention them so often, yet never individually. Names appear briefly, then disappear. Lives reduced to fines, taxes, arrests, or deaths. Their humanity is visible only in fragments. And yet, within those fragments, resistance existed. Women negotiated. They refused clients. They formed alliances. They learned which guards accepted bribes, which streets were safer, which taverns warned of danger. They adapted constantly. Survival required intelligence as much as endurance. But adaptation was not liberation. The medieval prostitute lived in a state of permanent instability. There was no future to plan for, only a present to survive. Each day was calculated against hunger, violence, and illness. Long-term thinking was a luxury reserved for others. Death came early and often unnoticed. When it did, it rarely marked the end of exploitation. Bodies were buried outside consecrated ground. Possessions were seized. Children were dispersed. The city moved on. Another woman replaced her. This cycle did not shock medieval society. It sustained it. And this is the final truth behind the question of what life was like for prostitutes in the Middle Ages. It was not a story of scandal or excess. It was a story of structural necessity. A life lived in full view, yet without protection. A role tolerated, regulated, and condemned simultaneously. A human cost paid quietly so that others could claim order, morality, and stability. The medieval prostitute did not exist on the edge of society. She existed at its pressure point. And when that pressure destroyed her, the system barely noticed because it was already preparing the next replacement. That is the reality history rarely lingers on, not because it is unclear, but because it is uncomfortable.